Hello everybody, welcome to this episode of the Altengrad city from City Skylines. Last week we filled some empty places in the old town and finished the castle hill in the center of the city. Today we will move to this place where we will build more modern blocks of buildings, university and a big park. So as you can see, this place that I showed you in the previous view of the city was quite large, and I was not exactly planning that, but at the end of today's episode we will actually finish that entire area, which is pretty much the entire place inside the road that goes around the oldest parts of the city, where maybe the old castle, well, not castle, but the city fortifications probably used to be. So this place is going to be more modern, like I said. This entire place, I even mentioned it when we were building the train station. This entire place was highly modernized, highly reworked in some like past decades maybe, or in the past century. So it contains many modern blocks of buildings, like I said, and it's even going to contain some interesting architecture in the form of a university building and some other very important and nice looking buildings. So again, I took inspiration from Dresden because they also have a very, very big park in the city, basically right next to the old town. It's a very big park, by the way. It's I think it's like 2 by 1 kilometers or something like that. So it's huge. It's absolutely gigantic, and we don't really have space for that in Altengrad. I think this park is some 400 meters or 300 meters wide, maybe 200, I'm not exactly sure. It's some low hundreds of meters wide, so it's definitely a lot smaller than the one in real life. But the one in real life also has some sort of a palace or chateau in the middle of it. So that's exactly what I did in here as well, because I had a very, very nice building for this very purpose. So I just kept it for this place, right? So that's the building that I already positioned in the middle of the park, and we're just going to be building around it. We also need to think, and that's pretty much what you saw in the first time-lapse shot, that I reworked some of the tram lines in this place. Well, I basically created that one tram intersection right where we already built everything. So it's this little square in front of the church, and we also needed to do some line that's going to go towards this new park. Now, like I said, we need to think about the future of the transportation in Altengrad, because it's going to be more difficult later to just rework some of the lines, so it's best to just place them right away and think about them. So I just added one more tracks that pretty much cut the entire old town, and they're gonna go from the theater building that's on the opposite side of the city, like episode 4 or something like that, all the way to this park, right? And there's also going to be connections from the train station, the through train station, the one that we built earlier, not the terminus one. So there's going to be all kinds of connections. I'm probably going to do some episode explaining the public transport in Altengrad. Probably need to do that for Aurelia as well. But I kind of want to still keep building the city so that we can talk a bit more about it. Now, you guys suggested that I should build some sort of a Jewish quarter in the city. Now, the problem with that is I'm not exactly sure how to do that. So I just decided to download some synagogue building. I'm not sure how it's pronounced in English. And placed it in some of these blocks because that's kind of how I saw it in Prague, for example, that you have blocks of buildings and that just a very small-ish building in the middle of it is exactly that. There's not that many buildings to choose from in the workshop. This is probably the best one. It's gonna be shown in the cinematics a bit more, right? So it's probably not like the typical Jewish quarter, pre-war Jewish quarter, I should say, but it's something, right? So this building, I'm not sure if this is a vanilla building or not. It's a high school building. So this place, this park, square, whatever you want to call it, is definitely going to have all kinds of structures. It's going to have a university, a high school, commercial buildings. It's going to have a ministry building as well. So everything is going to be on this square, right? So it's also going to form some sort of a second center of the city, more modern center of the city, where the public transport is going to just converge to this place, and it's just going to be very important. So even in the cinematics for today's episode, we're going to see quite a lot of people walking around this entire square. It's going to be very walkable because the center of the square, or the park itself, is obviously going to have pedestrian paths and all that. But I'm kind of jumping ahead here because we are still building these blocks of buildings. I'm showing just a couple of these blocks, how I built all of these blocks, or just the whole blocks. But later I'm just going to show you just the start of building some block and the end of it, because like I said in the previous episodes, it's more of the same, just filling these blocks. So even like I mentioned in the start of this episode, this place that I picked for today's build is quite large, and at the end of this episode, we're gonna see this place completely finished and even extended past the downtown of the city, let's say. So I think that for this episode, I built on the largest area from all the episodes that we have had in the Altengrad series. I think that for today's episode, the largest area was filled with buildings or parks or something, right? So that's kind of cool. It was not that difficult really, because some of these blocks I'm just putting buildings, and the courtyards or the backyards I'm not really detailing in any way, just putting some trees there. So it was not really that difficult. Some blocks, like for example this one that I'm building right here, I am going to detail somewhat because it's rather large, and it would not look that good if I just filled it with some trees and kept it, mostly green. As you can see, it is quite large inside. So after finishing the outline of the block, I'm making sure that I'm not using those like really large buildings, only the row buildings, maybe like 2 cells deep, away from the street, so that I can have some space inside. And this is exactly why I wanted to do that. So this is very typical. Even today, you can find many industrial-ish looking buildings inside of these blocks, especially if the blocks is large, obviously. But back in the day, when bigger factory complexes were not all that common just yet, people were working in these blocks. They were usually living in the buildings on the outside of this block, and just working inside of these blocks. And they might be all kinds of purposes for these buildings. Some workshops, all kinds of workshops, like mechanical shops, and even garages, maintenance garages for cars, and all kinds of trucks, or just warehouses. Various kinds of purposes might have been assigned to these buildings. We are on a sloped terrain in this block, so it was necessary to do some different elevations or different levels, or connect the different levels for the building. So for example, these stairs over here, just so it goes to that door on the building, and just doing some surfaces, cobblestone surfaces, and then just detailing this place. So it's just going to have some details like stains and all that. It's just going to look more interesting than just the simple gravel in here, or pretty much the mud, right? So it's going to be just these retaining walls and some surfaces on them. I think I'm going to later do one more block similar to this. It's going to be a lot smaller, but I'm just going to put some mud inside it, and maybe just some tiny details. But it's just pretty much this block. Maybe later, when I'm going to have some larger blocks, I'm going to do the same thing. But to be completely honest, I am a bit struggling with the industrial buildings, the selection of industrial buildings. So I'm pretty much exhausted the buildings that I can use for these purposes. So I don't really want to repeat them too much. So if I'm going to do something like this in the future, it's probably going to be, somewhere else. So it's not going to look like it's the same stuff just across the street, right? So this is what I was talking about. I'm just showing you the starts and ends pretty much of construction of these individual blocks. I don't know how many blocks we actually going to build in today's episode, but it's quite a lot, maybe around 10 blocks of these buildings. Like I said, it's not exactly all that difficult because it's just the buildings, but at the same time, I'm making sure that we are using some, variety of these buildings, not just using the same buildings all the time. But, the unfortunate truth in here is that some buildings just work best in these blocks, and some buildings just don't work absolutely everywhere. So I kind of tend to use the same buildings all the time, over and over again, but at least when I do that, I try to make them a different color with the painter mod, for example, so it's not going to look all that similar. So we are back with the square, and this is probably the second to last block that I'm going to build. I placed that ministry building right on the corner right there, which is definitely a nice place for a building like that. It's a very large building. It's a very nice looking building. From the front, from direction of the plaza, of the square. I'm still not sure how to call it. Should I call it the square or the park? I think I'm probably going to use the word square because it is a place that's going to be used by a lot of people. People are going to converge into this area to shop, to go to school, and all kinds of things. So it makes sense to call it a square. But it's a park as well. So whatever. You probably know what I mean, right? So this is the last block that we're going to finish on this side. There's going to be one other block. I was not exactly sure where to end building these blocks for today's episode because the park is large, and at the end of today's episode we are not going to be having buildings all around the park. I'm not still sure exactly how to do buildings around this park because I want to start making more, less dense structures, less dense blocks around, as far as we go, or further we go from the city center, I want to, lower density of these blocks. So maybe I'm going to do some more modern structures. I was actually thinking that I'm going to wait until we advance into the 30s at least, until I advance past this park, because I would like to do some more modern, like uniform built neighborhoods, not exactly these blocks. So maybe we're going to do something like that. So like I said, we're not going to finish all the buildings around the park. We're just going to finish the park, the square, some details, and some blocks around it. But we are probably going to keep it for some future episodes, the rest of it. I was doing the live stream yesterday from the Altengrad city, and we started doing a completely different project. We started doing a cargo port, which is going to be a project pretty much on the opposite side of the city. So it's kind of disconnected from what I'm building in here. I'm not exactly sure if in the next episode I'm gonna show you the cargo port. Probably yes, but I'm also thinking that I'm just going to continue doing some buildings around these parts of the city. But we will see. We will see. I'm thinking that I'm probably going to do the cargo port since I already started building it, right? So it makes sense. So I'm finally getting into the detailing and into just decorating the inside of the park. So first we needed to do some pedestrian connections. I used the bicycle paths. Those were bicycle paths because they have the very nice texture of some non-cobblestone pavement, which looks very, very suitable for this park, and they are also very narrow. I'm using the 6-meter wide version for the main path through the center of the park, and then I'm going to use a 3-meter version for pretty much all the rest of the roads around the park, the outline of the park, and some of those connections, just random connections through the halves of the park that are going to be created by the main one through the center. So this is going to be just a very nice looking, like a chill area inside the city, because the city is definitely going to continue past the park. So as we continue in time as well, the city is definitely going to expand. So this park, this square is going to be the center of the city pretty much. So it's going to be a nice thing that we're going to have something like this in the center of it. It's just not going to be, blocks of buildings all the time, but something quite different, right? So that's definitely something nice in the city. Now, the plans for the rest of this area, like I said, I'm not exactly sure if I'm not going to be using maybe modern buildings, like 30s buildings, more uniform, like workers' houses maybe. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I do have some buildings for that, by the way. That's pretty much why I want to do that, because I do have some 1930s, 1940s maybe buildings, some really nice architecture, so I can go and finally start doing something really modern, because pretty much all the buildings that I'm placing right now are some 19th century buildings, at least around the park. Of course, back in the core of the city, we used something slightly older, but in here I'm not yet really doing like 20th century architecture, right? So that's a bit of a shame, and I don't exactly have buildings from like really early periods of the 20th century. But 1930s, that is a time period. That's a decade where a lot of very interesting architecture just started popping up all around the European countries, right? Central European countries as well. So yeah, that's something that I really want to do in the future. Now, we also need to do the surfaces around this place. This was actually something that I, again, underestimated because I just built and built a huge area, and then it occurred to me, well, I knew it from the start, but then it hit me that I also need to do the surfaces, and it's not going to be all that easy. One thing that I made sure of is that this place is completely flat, so especially these backgrounds for the tracks are a lot easier to make, which is going to make my life a lot easier as well. So that's something that's good. But still, it took a long time to do the surfaces, but I think it's worth it. It's always worth it to really do these nicer cobblestone surfaces. I just don't have the vanilla ones. It's also to cover the crosswalks, for example, on some of these roads, and just do the intersections much nicer looking. Now we are finally getting to the part where we are going to make this into a proper park, and that is by just adding lots of green stuff, right? So lots of trees and these outline bushes, something colorful inside the city. So lots of these flowers, especially around the chateau in the middle of the park, and then all kinds of decorations. I was heavily inspired by how the Dresden garden, it's called garden, is done in real life. I'm not sure if it was done like this in when it was created first, but it's basically done so that there's like pockets of just grass, just complete emptiness, really, because I guess it's nicer to have some empty spaces in the city and not have it completely, covered with trees. So it's not a park, really, it's a forest. But I'm trying to just recreate some of the elements from it in Altengrad. So I'm randomly creating these pockets of trees and not having it symmetrical, because the park is kind of symmetrical, but not really because of the paths, the structure of the paths. And also I made sure that I do that tram stop, that tram intersection, so that it's going to break the symmetry of the park as well, which I think turned out really nice. And as you can see, the non-symmetry of the tree placement in the park is also looking rather good. So just finishing it, wrapping it up with these bushes on the outline of it. The pavement on the sides of the streets is not exactly all that wide, but that's kind of why I'm doing those outline paths in the park, so that people who want to just cross the park or just go side by side with the park, they can just use the pedestrian path on the edges of it instead of the pavements. Later I should probably just switch the pavement inside the park for something else, because this is just a bicycle path, so people are not really walking on it, they are just riding their bicycles. Anyway, last thing that I needed to do was get rid of some of those commercials from the buildings and do the cables on some of these intersections, because of course I'm using the wider intersections, just like I showed you in that tutorial video that I did earlier. Alright, so guys, that is absolutely all for today's episode. We are going to now see the cinematics, but before I go, I want to thank you for watching today's episode. I hope you liked it. If you did, then you can put a thumbs up underneath the video, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and if you want to really support the channel, then you can do that by clicking the join button below. I'm going to do the live stream next Wednesday from Altengrad again. We're going to be continuing working on the port, the cargo port, and of course this Sunday Aurelia episode as always. Thank you again for watching. Take care. Goodbye.